All right, so I'm Larry Shirley. I'm the chair of the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. And it's been around since 1982. It's almost 40 years old, driving sustainable energy and extremely important in all your lives, although you may not know it. We fly a little under the radar at times, but we are extremely important in terms of bringing renewable energy and sustainable energy forward in this country over that time period. Let me get used to it. Just got to get used to this. IREC is about three primary things that I want to cite. The first is regulatory reform. We're active in a bunch of states, intervening directly in Public Utility Commission proceedings and other forums to try to get the rules of the road right for renewables. We're also involved in developing a quality workforce. Since we founded and spun off NAPSEP, we've been active in credentialing, for example, training institutes, master trainers for solar, energy conservation specialists. We do accreditation in all those areas. And thirdly, we come at this as an independent organization. We're not beholden to industry or anyone, or government or anyone else, representing consumers and taking things from the consumer standpoint. That's our role. And we keep that fervently in mind all the time. We have guidelines for consumers to try to protect them, etc. These are the states. The states in red are the states on our regulatory program that we are actively right now intervening in to try to get the rules of the road right. And the areas that we work in are like interconnection. We've been in interconnection for years and years and years with developing model procedures and trying to get them in place. Now it's grid modernization. Energy storage has turned up big because it's all of a sudden come up at these proceedings, and there are no rules for it. And the energy and utility systems are having a hard time adjusting to it. And now even smart inverters have become a major topic for us. So in terms of our workforce development, I just want to point out three areas that we're currently training. We have trained over 5,000 firefighters so that when there's a fire at a building that has solar energy on it, they know what to do. When we got into that, they did not know what to do. And they would get there and equipment, they wouldn't know how to disconnect the equipment or what to do in that regard. So it's a very important sector. Building code officials, we trained over 5,000 of those in recent years because permitting, for example, is not standardized across the board in this country. And we've got a lot of different codes. We've got technologies evolving. The code officials have to be kept up to date. And most recently, we've gotten involved in training and accrediting facility managers and apartment service techs. So we get back to our challenge brought forward by our first two speakers today, which is certainly daunting. Do you know that over the last 3 years, we've had $450 billion worth of natural disaster damage in this country? That's 350% above the annual average dating back to 1980 for this country. Things are accelerating. Now, the IPCC report makes it clear that we have the scientific capacity, we have the technological understanding, and we have the financial means to tackle this question. But the real question is there the political will? Clearly, there is not on the national level, so we're going to have to look elsewhere for it. The good news is our challenge as a country is that we've got to get to 50% clean energy by 2030. We've got to become carbon neutral by 2050. We've got to attain 100% of our electricity from clean energy by 2050. And perhaps most daunting of all, we've got to convert our transportation fleet, our buildings, and our industries to clean energy. That is a very, very tall order. All of this is a very, very tall order, but we have to do it. The good news is the genie is out of the bottle in the field that we work in. And there's not going to be any way to put it back in. We've been smashing records in solar. wind and storage growth in recent years. Clean energy community in this country now, broadly defined, is a $64 billion industry employing 3.3 million people. Just look at solar. 13 gigawatts to be installed in 2019, 67 gigawatts already in place, and in the first quarter of this year, the lowest prices in history, despite the impact of the tariffs. Wind, 98 gigawatts installed in the U.S., 7.6 in the last year. 224 gigawatts predicted by DOE to be in place by 2030. More than 56,000 wind turbines operating across 43 states and territories, and $12 billion in new investment in the last year. Storage. Deployment in the first quarter of this year up 232% over first quarter in 2018. Expected to be a total of 4.5 gigawatts in place by 2024 in this country. California, on both the residential and non-residential side, has been driving this market, doing amazing things. And globally, we expect to have 40 gigawatts of storage installed by 2022. So what's the role of the states? The first role, absent of any federal leadership, is for us to take the gauntlet and lead, along with cities and communities in this country. And that means enacting mandatory, and I emphasize this, I'm not interested in soft goals that can be tossed aside. I've seen that so many times on the part of governors and others to just try to score political points. I'm interested in mandatory carbon reduction and clean energy standards that are put in place. We need to enact 100% renewable energy standards by 2050 with milestones along the way, and we better be at 50% by 2030. We need to enact energy-efficient resource portfolio standards. Many states have them now. They need to be at a 2 to 3% annual level in terms of the gains that we're getting. Massachusetts leads the country right now at 2.9%. New York just raised the bar to 3% that they're going for in the near future. We've got about 6 or 7 states above 2% right now. This can be done, but states have got to set their mind to it, and efficiency is absolutely crucial if we're going to reach our carbon reductions, and we're going to hold down demand enough that we can supply it with renewables. And finally, we've got to deal with transportation. We've got to adopt a goal of getting 22% of all new vehicle sales be zero-emission vehicles by 2025. And finally, the really tough one, we've got to put a price on carbon. And we have a number of states that participate in cap-and-trade programs right now, about 10, but we need to get many more states active in putting a price on carbon. So how do we get started in this? What do we do? You know, sometimes when I get angry, I start to put a picture of Russell Crowe up here in the, as the gladiator, but IREC told me to tone it down, you know, and put some ducklings up. So I did, you know. Well, okay. Well, we follow the leader. And there are a number of leaders. First, let's talk about Hawaii. First one to put in a 100% standard in 2015, 100% renewables by 2045. New Mexico, 100% clean energy by 2045. Vermont doesn't have a 100% goal yet, but folks, they've got an aggressive short-term goal, and I love that. 75% RPS by 2032, Renewable Portfolio Standard. And District of Columbia, bless their hearts, 100% by 2032. Let's go to the state of Washington. Governor Inslee was able to get past 100% clean energy by 2045. In Nevada, they have gone up to 50% RPS by 2030, very aggressive. Just been signing Nevada Energy some major storage contracts there. 100% clean energy by 2050. California, the big leader, the big driver, all these years and continuing so, has now brought their RPS to 50% by 2025, 60% by 2030, and 100% clean energy by 2045. We've got New York, though, not to be outdone, that has recently come in with a brand new law, and they want 70% RPS by 2030, 100% zero carbon grid by 2040, and 100% clean energy by 2050. And finally, Puerto Rico, in all their chaos, has passed a bill that would be 100% RPS by 2050. So my message to you is that policies really matter. Frontier Group in 2018 researched the factors that lead to market creation and market expansion, and they found that the single most important determinant of whether or not you have a successful solar market or renewable energy market is the degree to which state and local governments have recognized the benefits and created a fertile public policy atmosphere for its development. There are other factors that come into play: the price of energy, the wind resource in the Midwest, for example. But when it comes to solar, when it comes to energy efficiency, when it comes to storage, when it comes to electric vehicles, in state after state, if you look closely, the big driver has been the policies that have been enacted. RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standards, since 2000, for example, are responsible for 50% of the growth of the renewable energy sector. Energy efficiency standards put in place have resulted in those states in twice as much energy being saved as those states that have not. They matter, folks. They matter a lot. Let's start with the transportation sector, the biggest carbon emitter in this country. We've got to electrify it. We've got to get to zero-emission vehicles. And that's going to be a daunting task. But there are 10 states now with zero-emission vehicle regulations in place, driven by what has been done in California. And those call for 22% of all new sales ramping up to this in 2025 would be zero-emission vehicles. Those 10 states represent 30% of all the new car sales in the U.S., so they can be a big market driver. And the good news is EV sales increased 81% last year. When we look at efficiency, one of the key things is we've got to adopt and enforce more stringent building codes. Over half the states in this country have outdated building codes or no energy conservation-related codes at all in place. That's a big problem. We've got to enact resource standards, as I mentioned. We need utility on-bill financing and incentives. We need to do training with not only building code officials, but appraisers, realtors, facility managers. And if you're a state, you have to lead by example. You have got to mandate by law, if you can, but certainly by edict, that state buildings will reduce their energy use. I got this done in North Carolina in 2003. We did 30% reduction by 2015, and we've saved the state over $1 billion. This can be done. They're going to ratchet up to 40% now. This can be done. In solar, we need renewable standards, but we need a set-aside for distributed generation. New York has just done this. They've just put 6,000 megawatts of distributed generation they want in place by 2025. If you don't put in the set-aside for distributed generation, utility scale is just going to blow distributed generation away. It's happened in my state. We're second in solar capacity installed, and it's a tiny fraction that's distributed. It's all primarily utility scale. So you've got to have a set-aside for that. We need favorable tariffs on power purchase agreements. We need financial incentives still. It was tax credits that drove it in North Carolina. In some states, it may be rebates or performance incentives. It's sort of a jump start to your market. We need property or sales tax exemptions. The property exemption in North Carolina has been a big incentive. And on distributed solar, we've got to keep our eyes on interconnection policies. They can really stop solar in its tracks. We've got to enable community solar and promote it. We've got to fight for net metering, or at least get the best possible thing in its place. And we've got to make sure that third-party sales are legal and available in your state. On the wind front, we need renewable standards, but we need to set aside for offshore wind. A big component of meeting the renewable energy targets on the East Coast states is offshore wind. We've got to get that in place. Favorable interconnection and regulations, higher tariffs for offshore wind to get the market started when we get the infrastructure in place, and advanced transmission and distribution planning, because you're taking large amounts of power, you got to get them on shore, and then you got to get them to the load centers. All right, here we go, folks. Storage. One of the things driving storage now, procurement targets are now set up in 7 states. 3,000 megawatts by 2030 that New York wants to buy. California, New Jersey at about 2,000 megawatts. We need a reduction of regulatory barriers. We need financial incentives, things like Maryland, which has a tax credit of up to $5,000 for energy storage for residential and $75,000 for commercial. We need demonstration programs and consumer protections. And finally, we've got to put a price on carbon. And the states in the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic states and California through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative have really been a driver in that regard. They're driving for 75% reductions below 2005 levels by 2030. And California by 2030 wants to get 40% below that. All right, folks, it's time, it's really time now to muster all of our resolve and all the troops you can get to saddle up. The challenge before us is more daunting and is going to require a bigger mobilization than perhaps even the Great War. It will certainly require technological ingenuity, national support, and international collaboration on a scale that we have not witnessed in decades. And with federal leadership absent, states and communities have got to lead this. So, time to saddle up and put all the action that you can do and your organizations can do to make this happen. And there are many things you can do. Ensure that your ASES chapter is engaged in policy. I don't want to hear anybody say they can't lobby or they can't intervene at PUC commissions. They absolutely can. Support other nonprofits and trade associations active if you don't have an ASES chapter in your area. Provide research supporting the 100% milestone targets. You have the wherewithal, many of you I know, to do that. Write op-eds, comment on dockets and proposals and legislation, go social. And if you're a teacher or a professor, encourage your students to get active in this market. And if you don't think you can if you don't think you have the power to do something as an individual, consider for a moment Greta Thunberg, who in her search for a way to help, and she was totally exasperated, began sitting in protest on Fridays at the Swedish Parliament. The first time, she was all alone. The next week, a few people joined her. The next week, a few more. And now there are millions all across the globe that support her and the cause. Greta says our house is on fire. She said this to the World Economic Forum this year. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day, and then I want you to act. Ladies and gentlemen, the younger generations, the Gen Zers, the younger millennials, are crying out for us to take action. They know the present course the planet is on puts their future at grave risk. But it's the boomers, the Gen Xers, the older millennials who are in places of position and power and money to do something about this, to respond with decisive steps now, to keep us from not triggering an ecological, economic, and human catastrophe on a scale from which we can hardly imagine now. They are crying out to us. And God help us, we better heed that cry. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today to watch the 2019 recorded keynote speeches from Larry Shirley, Jonathan Foley, and Dave Renee. Again, please stay tuned for future and upcoming webinars from the American Solar Energy Society. I'm Carly Sapola, Director of Operations for ASES, and I want to thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.